The sun hung heavy in the sky, its oppressive heat pressing down on the nearly deserted street like a relentless judge passing sentence. Long, jagged shadows stretched across the fractured pavement, as if the earth itself were yawning under the weight of the day's burdens. Jason Hope moved through this stifling world with a steady, deliberate stride, his tall, lean frame cutting a quiet but commanding figure. At 50, his body bore the marks of a life hard-earned, solid yet unassuming, a testament to resilience rather than privilege. His face, etched with lines that told stories of struggle and survival, carried a calm assurance, the kind that only comes from wrestling with adversity and coming out the other side. But beneath that calm, in the depths of his dark eyes, a fire simmered, a quiet, relentless rage forged in the crucible of a world that had too often dismissed him. Today, that fire wasn't just a flicker, it was a steady flame, driving him forward with purpose. For decades, Jason had poured his soul into teaching, shaping young minds in classrooms where hope often felt like a scarce resource. He'd mentored countless students, built programs from the ground up, and fought tooth and nail for those society had cast aside. Each small victory, every student who found their voice, every program that gained traction had been a brick in the wall he'd built against despair. But those triumphs, meaningful as they were, had never been enough to quiet the restlessness in his chest. Jason understood a hard truth. Real change didn't come from words alone. No matter how eloquent or impassioned, it demanded power, raw, tangible power, and now, at long last, he was stepping into it, appointed to lead an initiative bridging the fractured divide between the police department and the African American community. He carried a mantle heavy with responsibility, but radiant with possibility. This was his chance to confront the systemic injustices he'd witnessed for years, not just with ideas, but with action. As he walked toward the precinct, his mind churned with a potent mix of resolve and anticipation. Each step a declaration that the days of silent endurance were over. The street was quiet, save for the distant rumble of an engine slicing through the stillness. Jason's instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of navigating a world that often saw him as a threat before a man, snapped to attention. His gaze flicked toward the sound, and a police cruiser rolled into view, its presence a familiar omen. A knot tightened in his gut, not fear, not anymore, but a wary expectation laced with defiance. He knew this script by heart, the flashing lights, the heavy footsteps, the inevitable assumption of guilt before a single word was spoken. The car slowed to a stop beside him, its tires crunching against the gravel-strewn asphalt. Two officers emerged, their movements brisk and practiced, as if they'd rehearsed this encounter 1,000 times. Williams, the taller of the pair, stepped out first, his broad shoulders squared and his face locked in a perpetual scowl that seemed carved from stone. His partner, Baker, followed, a younger man with a swagger that oozed arrogance, his sharp features twisted into a smirk that promised trouble. Jason knew them well. Over the years, he'd crossed paths with them too many times, their faces a recurring fixture in the landscape of his struggles. They weren't just officers. They were gatekeepers of a status quo that thrived on keeping men like him in check. "ID," Williams barked, his voice flat and cold, as if Jason's identity was a foregone conclusion, a criminal in waiting, unworthy of even basic courtesy. Jason didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago that any hint of resistance, any crack in his composure, would only fuel their aggression. His hand moved to his pocket with deliberate slowness, fingers brushing against the worn leather of his wallet. He pulled it out, the motion smooth and unhurried, and handed it over, feeling the familiar sting of humiliation prick at his insides. It wasn't just the demand that cut him, it was the way they stripped him down with their eyes, reducing him to less than a man, less than human. But Jason's face betrayed none of it. His expression remained a mask of stoic calm, a shield honed over years of enduring moments just like this moments, that were as routine as the sunrise and just as inevitable. The officers took the wallet with careless hands, flipping through it as if it were evidence of some unspoken crime. Williams barely glanced at the ID, his attention snagged instead by the modest stack of bills tucked inside. Baker's eyes lit up, a predatory gleam flashing across his face as he plucked the cash free, holding it aloft like a trophy. "Not your money, is it?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Found an easy way to make a quick buck, huh? The words landed like a slap, and Jason felt the heat of anger flare in his chest, a wildfire threatening to break free. But he swallowed it down, drawing a slow, steady breath through his nose. He'd been here before too many times to count standing silent, while men like these painted him with their assumptions, their biases, their disdain. To them, he was a caricature, a convenient target for their scorn. His very existence an affront to their authority. No explanation, no dignity, would shift the narrative they'd already written for him. Jason's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath his skin, but his voice, when he spoke, was level, measured. "That's mine," he said simply, knowing full well the words would bounce off their indifference like rain on concrete. Williams snorted, a low, derisive sound, while Baker's grin widened, his fingers tightening around the bills as if daring Jason to challenge him. The air between them thickened with tension, every glance, every smirk a reminder of the countless times Jason had been diminished, dismissed, dehumanized. He could feel the weight of their ridicule pressing down on him, a suffocating force that threatened to drown the man he'd fought so hard to become. But he stood tall, his silence a fortress, his mind racing with the memories of every injustice that had brought him to this moment. How many times had he been accused without cause? How many times had he been forced to swallow his pride, to endure, simply because the color of his skin marked him as less in their eyes? To Mannion yet, here he was, still unbroken. The encounter spiraled further as Williams loomed closer, his bulk casting a shadow over Jason like a storm cloud ready to burst. "You think you're something special, don't you?" he growled, his voice thick with condescension. "Just because you've got a few bucks in your pocket." Jason's eyes narrowed, a flicker of that inner fire breaking through, but he held his tongue. He wasn't here to spar with them, wasn't here to prove his worth to men who'd already judged him guilty. Still, the sting of their words burrowed deep, a sharp ache that went beyond the theft of his money. It was the assumption beneath its belief that he was a thief, a liar, a nothing that gnawed at him. "Maybe you're used to this kind of treatment," Williams muttered, his tone a mix of threat and disdain, "but I'd suggest you stay out of our way." Jason's heart pounded, a drumbeat of fury echoing in his chest, but his face remained an unreadable mask. Inside, the rage churned, a molten tide held back by years of discipline. They'd underestimated him before, countless times, and they were doing it again. But this time, the ground beneath them was shifting, and they didn't even know it. The officers' taunts grew sharper, their voices a chorus of contempt as they decided his fate. Without a word of explanation, without a shred of due process, they seized him not with handcuffs or formal arrest, but with the rough, lawless grip of men who saw themselves as above accountability. Jason stumbled slightly as they shoved him forward, their hands heavy on his shoulders, their boots clacking against the pavement with a rhythm that mocked the very idea of justice. They marched him down a dimly lit hallway inside the precinct, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and disinfectant, the walls closed in, gray and unyielding, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry insects. They pushed him into a small, sterile room, its single flickering lamp casting harsh shadows across a scratched metal table. Jason sat, his back straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap, while Williams and Baker lingered in the doorway, their smirks cutting deeper than any blade. They didn't stop there. The mockery flowed freely now, a torrent of insults and jabs as they circled him like vultures. Baker leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his voice a lazy drawl as he taunted. "What's the matter? Thought you'd talk your way out of this one." Williams paced slowly, his heavy footsteps a deliberate cadence, each one a reminder of the power he wielded or thought he did. To them, Jason was a punching bag, a man to be broken, a symbol of everything they despised. But as their words rained down, Jason's mind turned inward, weaving a tapestry of resolve. This wasn't just about the money they'd taken, or the humiliation they heaped upon him. This was about a system that emboldened men like them to abuse their power without consequence. A system that had kept him and so many others in its chokehold for too long. And now, irony of ironies, he was their new boss, how they didn't know it yet. In that cramped, flickering room, the lesson crystallized for Jason with piercing clarity. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed by those Who held power? It was a fire that had to be stoked, a battle that had to be fought. Williams and Baker, in their arrogance, embodied the rot he'd been tasked to uproot. Their abuse of authority wasn't just a personal slight, it was a symptom of a deeper sickness, one that thrived on unchecked power and festered in the shadows of apathy. As they laughed and jeered, oblivious to the seismic shift about to upend their world, Jason sat in silence, the weight of his new role settling over him like armor. The consequences of their actions would soon come crashing down, not as vengeance, but as a reckoning, a reminder that power, when wielded without accountability, inevitably sows the seeds of its own downfall. For Jason, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. In the suffocating confines of a dimly lit interrogation room, Jason Hope sat motionless, his hands resting calmly on the cold metal table before him. Every fiber of his being trembled with a silent, burning demand for justice, a yearning for the respect that had been so callously stripped from him. The air was thick with tension, pressing against his chest like an iron grip. Yet his face betrayed none of the chaos raging within. He was a storm contained, a force of nature held back by sheer will. The officers across from him, Williams and Baker, had no inkling of the man they were trifling with, nor would they grasp it until the inevitable day of reckoning descended upon them. For now, Jason's only task was to stand firm, to endure. Yes, they had humiliated him, dragged his name through the mud with their sneers and taunts. But in this moment, he felt an unshakable power rising within him. This was not the end of his story, it was merely the beginning of theirs. "Are you sure you know who you're talking to?" Jason's voice sliced through the oppressive silence, steady as a blade, yet laced with an edge so sharp it seemed to carve the air itself. The words hung there, heavy and deliberate, a gauntlet thrown down before the two men. For a fleeting second, the officer's eyes met Williams with his stern, weathered glare, and Baker with his youthful, kosher Grenada ripple of uncertainty passed between them. Their pride, a towering fortress they'd built over years of unchecked authority, refused to let them admit they might have misjudged him. But the atmosphere was shifting, curling around them like smoke they couldn't escape. Jason was no longer just a figure they could mock and discard. He was something greater, something they couldn't yet comprehend. And soon they would come face to face with the consequences of crossing a man like him. The room itself seemed to close in, its flickering fluorescent light casting harsh shadows across the cracked walls. Jason's stillness was unnerving, his posture rigid yet composed, as if he were a statue sculpted from defiance. Inside, his mind churned like a tempest, thoughts of every insult, every dismissive glance, every moment these so-called protectors of the law had trampled over him replaying in vivid detail. They had mocked him, laughed at his expense, treated him as less than human. Yet here, in this claustrophobic cage of concrete and steel, Jason discovered something unexpected: control. It wasn't loud or brash, it was quiet, unshakable, and all the more powerful for it. Across the table, Officers Williams and Baker sat, their initial swagger now tinged with something else, a confusion, perhaps even the faintest hint of doubt. They had walked in with the confidence of men who believed the world bent to their will, certain that Jason, this nobody in their eyes, would crumble beneath their pressure. How wrong they were. Williams, the older of the two, carried himself with the weight of experience, his broad shoulders squared as if ready to shoulder any burden. His stern gaze had been a weapon he wielded freely when they'd first dragged Jason in, leaning forward with a predatory gleam in his eyes, eager to heap more scorn upon his captive. Beside him, Baker was a different beast, younger, brasher, his smirk a permanent fixture as he reveled in the power he thought they held. In those early moments, they'd been a united front, their arrogance a tangible force in the room. But as the seconds stretched into minutes and the tension coiled tighter, there certainly began to fray at the edges. Jason didn't flinch. He didn't cower. Instead, he seemed to grow, his calm demeanor a shield they couldn't pierce, a mirror reflecting their own inadequacies back at them. The more they pushed, the more frustrated they became, their taunts falling flat against his unyielding silence. "You think you're some big shot, don't you?" Williams growled, his voice dripping with venom as he leaned closer, his narrowed eyes boring into Jason like a drill. He was a man accustomed to breaking people, to watching them shrink under his scrutiny, and Jason's refusal to bend gnawed at him. But Jason didn't so much as blink. His gaze remained locked on Williams, steady and unflinching. "You don't know anything about me," he replied, his tone low but resolute. Each word weighted with a quiet strength that seemed to echo in the small space. Baker, lounging back in his chair with his arms crossed, let out a scoff, his mocking grin widening. "What, you think you're special?" he shot back, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Just another thug trying to game the system." Jason's fingers tightened ever so slightly on the table, the only sign of the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. Those words stung. How could they not? They weren't just insults. They were a dagger plunged into the heart of everything he'd fought against for years. The prejudice, the lazy assumptions, the hatred baked into the very system these men represented, it all came rushing back. To them, he was nothing more than a stereotype, a convenient target for their disdain. But Jason knew the truth they couldn't see. He was more than their narrow minds could fathom. He wasn't here to lash out in anger, to give them the reaction they craved. No, he was playing a longer game, one forged in the fires of past injustices. He'd endured worse than this far worse and had learned a hard-earned lesson. The truest weapon against tyranny wasn't violence, but resilience. The ability to stand tall when the world tried to crush you. "You really don't know who you're talking to," Jason said again, his voice dropping to a colder, sharper register. There was no hesitation now, no trace of the self-doubt that might have flickered in him earlier. His words were a declaration, a challenge that struck at the core of everything these officers believed about him, about his worth, his place in their warped hierarchy. Williams froze, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his grizzled face before he buried it beneath his usual bluster. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, leaning in even closer, desperate to claw back the control slipping through his fingers. "You're just another guy with a chip on his shoulder." Jason leaned back slightly, meeting Williams' gaze with a quiet, unshakable confidence. "No," he said, his voice as steady as stone. "I'm not just another guy. I'm your boss. I'm the man who holds the power to make you answer for this, and believe me, I will." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room with a weight that left the officers reeling. Williams and Baker exchanged a glance, their unease palpable now. Were they dealing with a bluff, or had they stumbled into something far bigger than they'd realized? Jason didn't give them time to recover. He could see a subtle widening of their eyes, the way their shoulders tensed as their full weight of superiority began to crumble. Doubt seeped in, eroding the foundation of their bravado. "You think you've got this all figured out, don't you?" Jason continued, his voice growing colder, his resolve hardening like steel. "You've humiliated me, mocked me, thought you could walk away unscathed. But let me make one thing crystal clear. I'm not the one out of control here." Williams' face paled as the gravity of Jason's words sank in, his once impenetrable armor cracking under the pressure. Baker shifted in his seat, his cocky grin faltering as he glanced at his partner for reassurance. Finding none, Jason leaned forward just a fraction, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Yesterday, you thought you could treat me like I was nothing. You thought I was just another guy you could push around. But today, I'm the one in charge. And from now on, every step you take, every word you speak, will be under my watch." For the first time since they'd swaggered into the room, Williams and Baker were speechless. The power they'd clung to so fiercely had slipped away, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. The tables had turned, and Jason Hope now sat at the head of this twisted game. The weight of their actions settled over them like a suffocating shroud, a bitter reminder that their cruelty, their abuse of power, would not go unanswered. Jason could see it dawning in their iced slow, creeping realization that they'd underestimated him, that their misdeeds would come back to haunt them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. He wasn't just a man they'd wronged, he was the reckoning they'd never seen coming. As Jason sat there, watching them squirm, their false confidence unraveling with every passing second, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. They had thought him beneath them, a pawn to be toyed with and discarded. But now, they were beginning to see the truth. Jason Hope was no ordinary man. He was unbreakable, forged in the crucible of adversity, and he would not be silenced. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice soft yet carrying the weight of a lifetime spent enduring and overcoming the worst the world could throw at him. The officers had no answer, their silence a testament to the lesson they were only just beginning to learn. Justice, when wielded by a man like Jason, was a force that could topple even the mightiest of tyrants, and the consequences of their arrogance, they would echo far beyond this room, a warning to all who dared to abuse the power entrusted to them. The air in the room hung heavy, thick with a stillness so profound it seemed to choke every sound before it could escape. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was deafening, a roaring void that swallowed the confidence of the two officers seated across from Jason Hope. Once they had strode through life with the unshakable certainty of men cloaked in authority, their badges glinting like shields against any challenge. Now, though, Officers Williams and Baker sat hunched, their shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. Their eyes darted nervously, searching for something anything anger them in this moment where control had slipped through their fingers like sand. Jason, on the other hand, was a pillar of calm, his presence radiating a quiet strength that filled the space. The tension crackled between them, a silent war waged not with weapons or words, but with the raw force of Wilson steady and unyielding, the other crumbling beneath its own hubris. Jason's journey to this moment had been forged in fire. Life had thrown every hardship imaginable his way, poverty, prejudice, betrayal, and yet here he stood, unbroken. His dark eyes, sharp and piercing, held a depth that spoke of sleepless nights and battles fought in the shadows of a world that had tried to crush him. He didn't need to shout or fling accusations. His very existence was enough to unravel the officers' carefully constructed facades. Williams, the taller of the two, shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the armrests until his knuckles whitened. The smug grin he'd worn so easily yesterday had vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease that danced across his face like a shadow. Baker, shorter and stockier, tried to cling to his usual swagger, but the effort was futile as Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, the cockiness draining from his posture with every passing second. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a small, drab space within the police station, its walls a dull gray that matched the overcast sky visible through a single, smudged window. A rickety wooden table separated Jason from the officers, its surface scarred with years of scratches and coffee stains. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows that sharpened the lines of tension on every face. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked, each second stretching into eternity as Jason let the silence stretch, a deliberate pause that weighed heavier than any words could. When he finally spoke, his voice sliced through the stillness like a blade, steady and cold, laced with a truth that carried the bite of winter wind. "You thought you could get away with it," he said, his tone even but brimming with an icy resolve. "You thought you could drag me down, humiliate me, and walk away untouched. You thought there'd be no price to pay." His words landed like stones, sinking deep into the pit of the officers' stomachs, stirring a nausea they couldn't suppress. William's gaze dropped to the table, his hands trembling faintly as he avoided the unyielding stare pinning him in place. Baker's lips twitched, as if he wanted to retort, but the bravado he'd once wielded so effortlessly had abandoned him, leaving only a hollow shell of the man he'd been. Jason leaned forward slightly, his hands resting calmly on the table, fingers interlaced. "You might see me as just another face in the crowd," he continued, his voice growing firmer, a quiet fire igniting beneath the surface. "Just another man you've stepped on to feel taller. But I'm here to show you something different. I'm here to prove that people like you don't get to trample over lives and walk away clean anymore." The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that pressed against the officers' chests, making it harder to breathe. For years, they'd thrived in their roles, cocooned in the power their uniforms granted them. They'd bent rules, silenced voices, and crushed spirits, all with the arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. But now, in this cramped, suffocating room, that illusion was unraveling, thread by thread. Williams finally lifted his head, his face pale. The color leached from his skin as if the reality of his situation had drained his blood. His eyes, once sharp with disdain, now flickered with something closer to dread. He'd spent years building a reputation as the unflappable enforcer, the one who could intimidate with a single glance. But that man was gone, replaced by someone smaller, frailer, staring into the abyss of his own making. Beside him, Baker's facade cracked further, his broad shoulders slumping as he muttered under his breath, What are you going to do to us?" His voice trembled, a thread of fear weaving through the words, stripping away the mockery he'd once flung so carelessly at Jason. Jason didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the creak of the wood echoing in the stillness. His eyes never wavered, locked onto the officers with an intensity that made them squirm inside. His mind churned not with rage, but with purpose. He could feel the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. The memory of yesterday's humiliation still raw, the way they'd laughed as they shoved him against the wall, the jeers that had followed him down the street. But he wouldn't let that fury guide him. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice, about tearing down the rotting foundation that had propped up men like Williams and Baker for far too long. After a long, deliberate pause, he spoke again, his voice measured but resolute. "I'm not here to ruin your lives for the sake of it," he said, each word chosen with care. "I'm here to make sure the system that shielded you's one that let you abuse your power without a second thought crumbles. Your actions, your choices, they're why people have lost trust in everything you stand for. You, Williams, Baker, you're not just cogs in the machine. You're the rust eating it alive." His words rang out like a judge's gavel, final and unyielding, and the officers flinched as if struck. They'd underestimated him, dismissed him as a nobody, a fleeting annoyance they could brush aside. Now, that mistake glared back at them, stark and undeniable. Jason's gaze flicked to the door, where his secretary, Maria, stood quietly, her silhouette framed in the dim light of the hallway. She was a slight woman with a stern jaw and eyes that missed nothing, a loyal ally who'd seen the worst of this town and chosen to stand with him anyway. Her presence bolstered him, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. Turning back to the officers, he delivered the verdict they'd been dreading. "You're suspended, effective immediately," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "There'll be a full investigation into everything you've done, every rule you've twisted, every life you've trampled, and if it all checks out, you won't just lose your badges. You'll lose any shred of respect you ever had. This isn't a warning, it's a guarantee." The words hung there, heavy and final, the sound of their careers collapsing around them. William's hands shook visibly now, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he exchanged a glance with Baker. Baker's face twisted, a mix of disbelief and panic, his fingers digging into the table as if it could anchor him against the storm bearing down. They weren't the ones in charge anymore. The power they'd clung to had slipped away, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, and utterly human. But Jason wasn't finished. He watched them for a moment longer, letting the weight of their guilt settle in. He could see it in their iced, dawning realization that their actions had consequences, that the armor of their authority couldn't protect them forever. "This is just the start," he said, his voice softening but still carrying an edge of steel. "It's not only about you two. It's about making sure what you've done, what people like you have gotten away with, never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone." He paused, letting the silence reclaim the room, the gravity of his mission sinking into their bones. "Yesterday, you thought I was nothing," he added, a fierce glint flashing in his eyes. "Today, you'll see I'm the future of justice in this city." With that, he rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, each step a testament to the resolve that had carried him this far. The sound of his shoes against the worn linoleum echoed like a drumbeat, steady and sure. He crossed the room to the door, his hand resting briefly on the knob before he turned back for one final look. "Good luck," he said, his voice low, laced with both finality and a quiet triumph. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound reverberating like the closing of a chapter. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky a muted gray over the small southern town that had been his battleground for so long. Jason paused on the station steps, the weight of his victory settling over him, not just a personal triumph, but the first spark of something greater. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire, igniting whispers that grew into a roar. By the next day, the town buzzed with a restless energy, a storm brewing in the wake of Williams and Baker's suspension. Local reporters swarmed the streets, their cameras flashing as they interviewed residents and women from the African American community who'd borne the brunt of the officers' cruelty for years. Their voices, long silenced, now rose in a chorus of support, praising Jason's courage, his unwavering vision for a reckoning. Maria stood beside him as they watched the chaos unfold, her arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She'd been there through the worst of it late night's plotting, the threats whispered in dark corners, and now she saw the fruits of their labor taking root. The media frenzy painted Jason as both hero and harbinger, a man who'd turned humiliation into a weapon for change. Headlines screamed of corruption exposed, of a system teetering on the brink. But Jason knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead stretched long and treacherous, lined with resistance from those who'd thrived in the shadows of power. Yet he stood taller now, unshaken, a beacon in a city that had forgotten what justice looked like. Williams and Baker, meanwhile, faded into the background, their names whispered not with reverence but with scorn. The lesson was clear: power, when wielded without accountability, was a fragile thing, destined to shatter under the weight of its own excess. And Jason Hope, once a man dismissed as powerless, had become the hand that struck the first blow, a living testament to the truth that justice, though slow, was relentless. The city would never be the same, and neither would he. The city buzzed with a restless energy, its polished exterior beginning to splinter under the weight of long-buried truths. People had started to notice the flossed cracks in the system's carefully constructed Fawadi, and Jason's voice, steady and resolute, cut through the noise like a beacon. His calls for change echoed through crowded streets and quiet homes alike, stirring something deep within those who had grown weary of empty promises. Hope flickered in their eyes, a fragile but growing flame. Yet not everyone welcomed this shift. Deep within the shadows of power, where old traditions clung like ivy to crumbling stone, a stubborn faction resisted. The old guard-seasoned officers with weathered faces and iron will stood firm, their loyalty tethered to a decaying structure that had long favored them. To them, Jason wasn't a savior. He was a storm threatening to uproot their world. In dimly lit backrooms, these men huddled, their voices low and conspiratorial, plotting ways to dim Jason's rising star. They saw his every move as a direct challenge to their authority, a reckless bid to topple the order they'd spent decades upholding. Words like upstart and troublemaker slipped from their lips as they schemed, their fingers tracing the edges of whiskey glasses, the amber liquid catching the faint glow of flickering bulbs. Meanwhile, the mayor, a man of calculated smiles and practiced neutrality, played a more subtle game. In public, he clapped Jason on the shoulder, his words dripping with vague support. But behind closed doors, doubt gnawed at him. He paced his office, the hardwood floor creaking under his polished shoes, wondering if Jason's relentless push for reform was a spark that could ignite chaos. The system, flawed as it was, had stood for generations of brittle but familiar scaffold. To tear it down so quickly, he feared, might send the whole city tumbling into disarray. Jason, though, carried no such hesitation. His heart burned with a clarity that left no room for compromise. He understood the enormity of what he was up against: decades of entrenched corruption, a labyrinth of rules designed to protect the powerful, but he refused to falter. Night after night, he sat hunched over his desk, the faint hum of the city filtering through his window. Papers littered the surface, draft policies scribbled in his precise hand, stacks of complaints from voices long ignored, notes from meetings with community leaders whose weary faces mirrored his own resolve. Sleep eluded him, his mind racing with visions of a city reborn. Sometimes, in the quiet hours, he'd pause, rubbing his tired eyes, the weight of his mission pressing against his chest like a physical thing. But then he'd think of the families he'd visited, people whose lives had been scarred by the very system he aimed to dismantle. He remembered the tremble in a mother's voice as she recounted her son's unjust arrest, the quiet dignity of a father who'd lost everything to unchecked power. Those moments fueled him, stoking a fire that no exhaustion could quench. Yet, as his influence grew, so did the resistance. Whispers turned to accusations, carefully crafted to chip away at his credibility. Anonymous letters slipped under doors and leaked reports surfaced in the press. their words sharp and insidious. Some painted Jason as a man driven by selfish ambition, his judgment clouded by personal vendettas. Others questioned his experience, sneering that a former teacher couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of leading such a seismic shift. The attacks were relentless, a barrage of half-truths and veiled praise meant to sow doubt among his supporters. In public, his detractors smiled, their compliments laced with poison. In private, they sharpened their knives. Jason felt the sting of each blow, the frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. But he refused to bend. To him, this was no mere skirmish, it was a crucible, a test of his unshakable belief that justice was worth any cost. He'd faced worse in his years of quiet defiance, and he knew the people's will outweighed the schemes of a fading elite. One gray afternoon, as rain streaked the windows of his cramped office, Jason sat lost in thought. The weight of the fight pressed down on him, his shoulders slumping slightly under an invisible burden. A sharp knock jolted him upright. Clara, his secretary, stepped inside, her youthful face taut with worry. She clutched a notepad to her chest, her knuckles pale. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray her nerves. "There's a meeting at City Hall. The mayor's called it. Some of the department heads will be there too." Her eyes met his, wide and searching, as if she sensed the storm brewing. Jason nodded, rising slowly. He smoothed the wrinkles from his jacket, the motion deliberate, a quiet act of resolve. He'd known this moment was inevitable. Each day the resistance would shed its subtlety and confront him head-on. Whatever happened in that room, he told himself, would either propel his vision forward or shatter it entirely. Either way, he was ready. The air in City Hall hung heavy, thick with unspoken tension, as Jason stepped inside. Heads turned, eyes narrowing, tracking his every move. The long table stretched before him, its polished surface reflecting the cold light of overhead lamps. At its head sat the mayor, his posture stiff, his smile a thin mask that didn't reach his eyes. Flanking him were the high-ranking officersmen, with stern jaws and graying temples, their uniforms crisp, their presence imposing. Jason scanned the room, noting the absences. Officers Williams and Baker, once loud voices of derision, were nowhere to be seen. Their time, it seemed, had slipped away, though their echoes lingered in the steely gazes of their allies. "Jason," the mayor greeted, his tone smooth but edged with caution, "I'm glad you could join us. Please, take a seat." Jason complied, settling into the chair with a quiet confidence, his spine straight, his hands resting lightly on the table. He'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times, steeling himself for the battle he knew was coming. The mayor cleared his throat, the sound slicing through the silence. "We've all seen the recent developments," he began, his words measured, each syllable chosen with care. "And while I admire your passion for reform, Jason, we must consider the bigger picture. The public's excited, yes, but this department has operated a certain way for decades. There's valid concern about the pace of your changes." The officers nodded subtly, their expressions unreadable yet unmistakably aligned. Jason raised a hand, his movement calm but firm, cutting the mayor off mid-breath. "With all due respect," he said, his voice steady as granite, "the department's concerns have always trumped the people's needs. For too long, this city has borne the burden of a system that fails them, chews them up, and spits them out. That ends now." The mayor's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation breaking his composure. "And you think you can overhaul it overnight? This isn't a classroom, Jason. There are procedures, traditions." "I'm not here to beg for approval," Jason interjected, his gaze locking with the mayor's. "I'm here to ensure the people, especially the African American community, feel safe, respected, heard. The system should serve them, not crush them." A heavy silence fell, the air crackling with unspoken challenges. The mayor shifted, discomfort etching lines into his face. "I get your drive, Jason, but let's be practical. We can't just tear everything down." Jason leaned forward, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "The system's already broken, rotted through. Defending it, shielding it, only deepens the wound. Justice demands we act, not cower." The room stilled, the weight of his words settling over them like dust after a collapse. The officers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering. They'd misjudged him, underestimated the fire in his soul. Finally, the mayor sighed, his resistance crumbling under Jason's unyielding resolve. "Move forward with your reforms," he conceded, reluctance threading his tone. "But tread carefully. We can't afford chaos." Jason nodded, a spark of triumph lighting his eyes. "There's no chaos in justice, only progress." As he stepped out of City Hall, the rain had stopped, the sky clearing to reveal a faint sliver of sun. Energy surged through him, a tidal wave of purpose. He'd faced the old guard and emerged not just intact, but victorious. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, but each step felt lighter, buoyed by the growing chorus of voices rallying behind him. His dream, a city where power answered to the people, was no longer a distant hope. It was taking root. Back in his office, Jason sank into his chair, the day's triumph mingling with a quiet unease. He was no longer just a voice, he was the fulcrum of a movement. A former teacher turned unlikely leader. He now held the reins of a system that had once sought to silence him. The irony wasn't lost on him how fate had twisted the narrative, placing him at the helm of change. But the weight of it pressed harder now. Reforming the department meant more than ousting men like Williams and Baker, whose names still lingered on the misconduct files stacked before him. It meant uprooting a culture that had thrived on privilege and prejudice, a poison that had seeped into every corner. He traced a finger over the papers, his mind racing. The people stood with him, their faith a lifeline, but the old guard's shadow stretched long. True justice, he knew, wasn't just laws on paper, it was a shift in the city's soul. And that battle, the one for hearts and minds, was only beginning. Clara lingered in the doorway, watching him with a mix of pride and worry. She'd seen every late night, every furrowed brow, every small victory etched into his tired frame. "You did it," she said softly, stepping closer. Jason smiled faintly, the lines of exhaustion softening. "We're just starting, Clara. The real work's ahead." She nodded, her faith in him unspoken, but palpable outside. The city hummed, awake and alive, its pulse quickening with hope. Jason's victory had ignited something unstoppably, a reckoning for those who'd abused their power. A promise that justice, though slow, was relentless. The lesson rang clear: power unchecked breeds ruin, but courage, rooted in righteousness, could reshape the world. The weight of the world seemed to press down on Jason's shoulders as he sat hunched over his desk, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the scattered papers. He wasn't just fighting a battle, was waging a war against a beast that had grown fat and arrogant over generations, feeding on the trust of the people it claimed to protect. The air in his office was thick with the scent of ink and old coffee, a testament to the sleepless nights he'd spent unraveling the threads of a corrupt system. He needed people to feel the crushing consequences of their greed, to look in the mirror and see the rot they'd nurtured. Change wasn't just an option. It was the only path left to salvage what remained of their town's soul. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. Snapping his focus back to the present, the sound echoed in the quiet room, a sudden intrusion into the fortress of his mind. Clara, his secretary, slipped inside with the grace of someone who'd learned to tread lightly in the presence of heavy burdens. Her arms cradled a fresh stack of files, their edges worn and slightly curled, as if they too carried the exhaustion of their contents. She moved silently across the creaky wooden floor, her footsteps muffled by years of dust trapped in the grain, and set the pile on his desk with a soft thud. "These just came in, Jason," she said, her voice a quiet murmur laced with urgency. "There's something here you need to see." Jason didn't lift his gaze from the document he'd been studying, his fingers tracing the lines of text as if they might reveal some hidden truth. The fight he'd taken on wasn't confined to the grimy walls of a single police precinct. It stretched far beyond, into the very bones of a town built on secrets and lies. "What is it?" he asked, his tone steady but edged with a resolve that had hardened over years of betrayal. He could feel the heat of determination burning in his chest, a fire stoked by every injustice he'd witnessed. Clara hesitated, her fingers lingering on the edge of the files as if reluctant to let go of the weight they carried. She was a slight woman, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a flicker of defiance that had grown brighter. the longer she worked with Jason. "It's about some of the officers we're investigating," she said finally, her words measured, words spreading. "They're meeting with city council members, influential officials. There's a web of power here, Jason. It's bigger and deeper than we ever imagined." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, though his face betrayed nothing but a tightening of his jaw. He'd always suspected the corruption wasn't just a handful of rogue cops skimming cash from petty crimes. No, this was a machine, oiled and maintained by the hands of the powerful, stretching its tendrils into every corner of the city. Jason's life had been molded by this system, the unfairness that had crushed his family, his neighbors, his hope, until he'd decided to fight back. He'd made a vow, not just to himself but to every weary face he'd met on the streets, that he'd rip it apart, brick by rotten brick. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the files Clara had brought, his fingers brushing the coarse paper as he pulled them closer. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the pages, each line of fresh wound reports of officers cozying up to the town's richest tycoons, laundering money through backroom deals, twisting city contracts into knots of personal profit. This wasn't petty theft. It was a syndicate wearing the mask of legitimacy, a betrayal of every value the town pretended to hold dear. Jason's breath caught in his throat, a storm of anger and purpose brewing behind his calm exterior. He set the papers down with a quiet resolve, the sound of them hitting the desk like a gavel striking wood. "We need to move quickly," he said, rising to his feet. His chair scraped against the floor, a harsh note in the stillness. "This stops now. The people deserve more than this." His words hung in the air, a promise and a threat rolled into one. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the cracked windows of the community center, painting golden streaks across the faces of the leaders Jason had summoned. The room buzzed with tension, a restless energy crackling among the group, young activists with fire in their voices, older organizers with weary lines etched into their skin, all bound by a shared hunger for justice. Jason stood at the front, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of their expectations. He could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of hope and dread, as if he were both their shield and their sword. They'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to turn their years of whispered outrage into action. Now, the hour had arrived. "We have a chance," Jason began, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. It was firm, unshaken, though his heart pounded with the gravity of what he was about to unleash. "But we can't afford to hesitate. What I've uncovered, it's not just the police. It's woven into the fabric of this city's leadership. The mayor's office, the council, the business elite, they are all tangled up in this mess." A ripple of agreement passed through the room, heads nodding, fists clenching. These weren't strangers to the fight. They'd spent years clawing at the edges of this injustice, their hands bloodied from the effort. Jason saw the spark of hope in their eyes, but also the shadow of fear. What if they failed? What if he succeeded, and the backlash swallowed him whole? "We've got proof," he continued, his gaze sweeping the room, locking eyes with each of them in turn. "But we need to be smart. The media's with us, and the public screaming for change, but we can't charge in blindly. We hit them where it stings, their wallets, their reputations. If we can expose the links between these dirty cops and the businesses they've been shielding, we'll have the leverage to topple this whole rotten structure." His words ignited a flicker of determination in the group, a shared resolve that pulsed through the air like a heartbeat. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and relentless effort. Jason and his team huddled in cramped offices, poring over documents until their eyes burned, chasing leads through a labyrinth of deceit. Clara was a constant presence, her quiet efficiency a lifeline amid the chaos. She'd bring coffee in chipped mugs, her hands steady even as her voice trembled with the latest discovery. Informants slipped them scraps of truth, names, dates, dollar amounts, each piece a brick in the case they were building. The pressure was suffocating, a vice tightening around Jason's chest with every passing day. The city's newspapers and TV stations buzzed with half-formed stories about the investigation, but there were quieter voices too, whispers from those who wanted the truth buried, who feared the light Jason was dragging into their shadows. He zeroed in on the ties between the police and the town's business moguls, men who'd strutted through life untouchable, their suits crisp and their smiles sharper than knives. They'd twisted the economy into their personal playground, buying influence with blood money while the people starved for fairness. Jason had spent years studying their game, memorizing every rule they'd bent, every loophole they'd exploited. Now, he knew exactly where to strike. Late one evening, as rain tapped a restless rhythm against the window, Clara stepped into his office, her coat damp and clinging to her frame. In her hands was a thick envelope, its edges sealed with the promise of revelation. "It's from the investigation," she said, placing it on his desk with a weight that seemed to sink into the wood. "They're scrambling to hide their tracks, but we've got something high-level land deals tied to the officers we've been chasing." Jason tore into the envelope, his pulse quickening as he scanned the pages. Names leaped out at him: cops, businessmen, council members, so linked to a chain of shady transactions. They'd snatched up public land, flipped it for profit, and pocketed the cash, all while preaching service to the community. The hypocrisy burned in his throat like bile. "This is it," he said, surging to his feet, the chair clattering behind him. "We've got them dead to rights. We go public tomorrow." His voice trembled with a mix of triumph and fury, the culmination of every sleepless night and broken promise. The next day, Jason stood before a sea of face reporters with flashing cameras, community members with clenched fists, officials with nervous glances darting between them. The air was electric, charged with anticipation as he approached the podium. His hands shook faintly, but when he spoke, his voice was a rock, unyielding and clear. "We've gathered evidence, irrefutable evidence that certain police officers, alongside local business owners and politicians, have been exploiting this town. They've manipulated land deals, stolen from the public, and built a system of inequality that's choked us for too long." The crowd hushed, hanging on his every word as he laid bare the corruption deals, the names, the betrayal. The tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with each revelation. But for Jason, it was a release. He was keeping his promise, forcing them to face the mirror of their actions. The aftermath was a tempest. The media swarmed, headlines screaming of scandal and greed. The town awoke, its pulse quickening with outrage and possibility. Jason stood at the eye of the storm, calm amid the chaos, knowing the fight was far from over. The officers were just the beginning. Behind them loomed the puppet masters, the businessmen and politicians who'd orchestrated this nightmare. Taking them down would demand more than evidence. It would require cunning, patience, and an unshakable will. Every day, he and Clara dug deeper, connecting dots across a sprawling web of power. The land deals were merely a symptom of a sickness that had festered in the city's heart, a lesson in how unchecked power devoured justice. Jason wouldn't stop until it was uprooted, until the people saw that change wasn't just a dream, it was a reckoning. In the fading twilight of weeks past, a subtle yet profound transformation began to ripple through a community long scarred by suspicion and dread. Where once division had re-etched deep into the lines separating black from white, young from old, a fragile unity was taking root. People from every corner of life, their voices hoarse from years of silence, started to gather round Jason, a man whose quiet resolve had become their beacon. They craved something more than survival. They yearned for change, for the scales of accountability to tip, for justice to rise like a tide and wash away the rot. Jason felt it all, to your hope, their desperation pressing down on him like a physical weight, urging him onward even as it threatened to crush him. Late one night, Jason sat alone in a room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and determination. The dim glow of a single lamp cast long shadows across walls plastered with whiteboards, each one a chaotic tapestry of names, dates, and arrows weaving a web of corruption he'd spent months untangling. His team had long since shuffled home, their footsteps echoing down the hall hours ago. But Jason couldn't tear himself away. Not now, not when the truth dangled so tantalizingly close, when the men who'd treated his town like a sandbox for their avarice and bigotry were almost within reach. His blood thrummed with purpose, but beneath it lurked a gnawing fear. Time was slipping through his fingers like sand. The shrill buzz of his phone jolted him from his reverie, the screen lighting up with Clara's name. His pulse quickened as he snatched it up, a flicker of anticipation sparking in his chest. "Jason, you need to see this." Clara's voice crackled through, taut with urgency. I just got a tipsamione from the inside. They're ready to talk. His mind ignited, thoughts racing like wildfire. An insider. This was a fracture in the wall he'd been hammering at for months. He surged to his feet, grabbing his jacket in one fluid motion, the fabric cool against his skin. "I'm on my way," he said, his tone steady as steel, though his heart pounded a frantic rhythm. "Don't let anyone leave." Clara was waiting for him at the office's front door, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of a street lamp. Her hands gripped a manila envelope so tightly her knuckles whitened, and her face, usually so composite, was pale, her eyes darting with unease. "I spoke to him," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the night. "He's a former officer, part of Williams and Baker's crew. He's scared Jason. They've already threatened him." Jason's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin. He'd known this wouldn't be easy, that peeling back the layers of this festering corruption would draw blood. But seeing Clara's tension, hearing the tremor beneath her words, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. This wasn't just a cause, it was a war. "Do you trust him?" he asked, his gaze narrowing as he searched her face. She met his eyes, her own steady despite the fear. "I do, but he's terrified. If we're going to use this, we need to move fast." Jason nodded, the stakes crystallizing in his mind. This man's testimony could be the keystone, the final piece that tied not just the cops but the politicians and profiteers into one damning knot. The next day, they met the informant in a desolate spot beyond the town's edge, where the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and unspoken dread. The man approached slowly, his shoulders hunched, his eyes flicking over his shoulder as if expecting shadows to lunge. Jason recognized him instant, line of the officers who'd served under Williams and Baker, a face he'd seen barking orders or smirking at protests. But now, that same face was hollowed out by fear, his hands trembling as they clutched a worn jacket. "They've been watching me," he rasped, his voice a fragile thread. "I don't know how long I can keep this up, but you're right, it's wrong. They've been running this town for years. I couldn't stomach it anymore." Jason's chest tightened with a sudden swell of empathy. This man wasn't a hero, not by any stretch, but his choice to speak to risk his livelihood, his safety, maybe even his life, carried a raw courage Jason couldn't ignore. "Tell me everything," Jason said, his voice soft but unyielding, settling onto a rickety bench as the man began to unravel his story. The words tumbled out haltingly at first, then faster, a flood of confession and guilt. He spoke of illegal land deals orchestrated by Williams and Baker, of bribes slipped into the pockets of local officials to grease the wheels, of witnesses silenced by threats delivered in the dead of night. It was worse than Jason had feared, a sprawling network of corruption that didn't stop at the police precinct but climbed higher, ensnaring politicians who traded protection for cash and businessmen who washed stolen properties clean through shell companies. As the man's voice broke under the weight of his revelations, Jason felt his own resolve harden. This wasn't just a broken system, it was a betrayal of the town's soul, a personal wound inflicted on every person who'd ever called it home. These were the same people who'd sneered at him, dismissed him, tried to bury him under their boots. Now, they'd answer for it. That night, Jason sat in his office, the informant's words echoing in his skull as he stared at the fresh stack of evidence before him. Clara had already tipped off the media, her voice buzzing with quiet triumph over the phone earlier. Jason had made the call. They were going public. The gravity of it settled over him like a storm cloud. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a reckoning. The town, the state, maybe even the nation would see this corrupt empire crumble, and he'd be the one to swing the hammer. His phone buzzed again, Clara's message glowing on the screen. "Press conference set for tomorrow. Are you ready?" He didn't hesitate. He'd been ready his whole life, not just to survive the weight of systemic racism, but to dismantle it, to lead the charge into something better. The next morning, Jason stood before a sea of reporters, the room crackling with anticipation as camera flashes pierced the air like lightning. His hands rested steady on the podium, but inside, his heart thundered. He spoke with a clarity that cut through the chaos, laying bare the officers' crimes, the businessmen's profiteering, the politicians' complicity. The evidence he presented, documents, recordings, The informant's testimony was a net no one could slip through. Then, with a quiet power that silenced the room, he turned to the city officials seated stiffly in the back. "This town has been choked by inequality for too long," he said, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. "That ends today. The corrupt will be exposed, and justice will be served." The room exploded into a frenzy of shouted questions as he stepped away, the weight of his words lingering like smoke. There was no retreat now, only the path forward. The fallout was swift and merciless. The police department buckled under scrutiny. Officers implicated in the scheme suspended or sacked as investigations clawed their way up the chain of command. The city's leadership squirmed as the spotlight widened, every denial sounding weaker than the last. Jason's name became a lightning rod, praised by those who saw hope in his stand, vilified by those who clung to the old ways. But he didn't falter. In the weeks that followed, he threw himself into the fight, demanding reform in the police force, pressing the city council to act, amplifying the voices of those long ignored. The old guard pushed back, their resistance fierce and bitter, but the people rallied behind him, a rising tide that swept away one corrupt pillar after another. It wasn't the end. Jason knew that. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. But it was a triumph, a crack in the foundation of a system that had thrived on abuse of power. For the first time, standing amid the whirlwind of change, he felt the ground shift beneath him, not toward collapse, but toward something new. The lesson was clear. Justice, when wielded by those it had forsaken, could topple even the mightiest towers. And the consequences of unchecked power? They were no longer whispers in the dark, they were a roar the world couldn't ignore. Days bled into weeks, and the city began to breathe differently, not because of the headlines or the televised chaos, but because of the quiet moments, the murmured conversations between neighbors over fences, the heated debates in diner booths, the tentative alliances forming among strangers on street corners. They all asked the same question: what can we do? This fight had outgrown Jason, spilling into the hands of a community waking from a long, restless sleep. The pressure on him grew heavier, the promises of reform a yoke he couldn't shed. But in fleeting instants, watching a child wave a handmade sign at a rally, hearing an elder's voice crack with pretty glimpse of future where truth didn't bow to power. It wasn't perfect, but it was possible, and that was enough to keep him going. In a world where the dignity of individuals was not a commodity to be traded, Jason Hope clung to a vision that propelled him forward, lifting him above the turbulent winds of politics, the pervasive rot of corruption, and the deep-seated animosity that had long shackled his community. Yet, standing at the edge of transformation was no simple feat. Even after years of peeling back the layers of deceit that had festered within the city's core, Jason could feel the immense burden of history bearing down on him like an unrelenting storm. This wasn't merely a fight against a handful of crooked officers or power-hungry politicians. It was a war against an entire machinery, an intricate web designed to segregate, suppress, and obliterate the voices of the powerless. Still, here he was, a solitary figure armed with an unshakable resolve to piece together a shattered system, brick by painstaking brick, until justice could stand tall once more. Late one evening, Jason sat alone in his dimly lit office, the only sound the faint, persistent hum of his computer cutting through the stillness. The room felt oppressively quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that defined his days. His fingers danced across the keyboard, sifting through an endless stream of documents, reports, testimonies, legal filings that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. Exhaustion gnawed at him, a quiet ache that settled into his bones, yet there was no pause, no moment of respite from the monumental task looming before him. He had ignited a spark of change, a flicker of hope that could one day blaze into something transformative. But he knew better than anyone that real progress was a slow, grueling march. As his eyes scanned the screen, tracing the threads of corruption he'd spent years unraveling, the sharp ring of his phone shattered the silence. His gaze flicked to the screen. Clara's name glowed in the dim light. Without hesitation, he snatched up the receiver, his heart already bracing for what might come next. "Jason, you need to be at the City Hall meeting tomorrow." Clara's voice crackled through the line, urgent yet steady, a lifeline in the storm. "Things are heating up. There's a new twist you won't see coming." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, tightening the knot of unease that had taken root in his stomach. The situation had spiraled faster than he'd anticipated, its tendrils reaching into corners of the city he hadn't even thought to guard. "What's happening?" he demanded, his tone edged with a sharpness born of sleepless nights and relentless pressure. "It's bad, Jason," Clara replied, her voice carrying the weight of grim certainty. "The police union is rallying against you. They're spinning it to look like you're waging war on the whole department, not just the bad apples. They're staging a public defense, digging up old fears, turning it into a circus about law and order instead of the truth you've been fighting for." Jason leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow, deliberate breath that did little to ease the fire simmering in his chest. He'd expected pushback. Resistance was inevitable when you challenged the powerful bit. Hearing it laid bare like this confirmed a dread that had been lurking in the shadows of his mind. This wasn't just a skirmish with a few rogue cops. It was a struggle for the very soul of the city. A test of whether justice could triumph over a narrative twisted by those who thrived in the dark. "I'll be there," he said, his voice resolute, cutting through the doubt that threatened to creep in. "I'll face them head on." As he hung up, the weight of his words settled over him. A promise not just to Clara but to himself. He couldn't falter now, not when the stakes were this high. The next day, Jason strode into the cavernous chamber of City Hall, his footsteps reverberating off the polished marble floors, like a drumbeat signaling the start of battle. The air inside was thick, heavy with tension that clung to every surface, every whispered conversation. All eyes turned to him as he entered, a mix of curiosity, hostility, and wary respect flickering in the faces of those gathered. At the front of the room stood the mayor, a man whose polished exterior barely masked his unease, his gaze darting nervously between Jason and the cluster of police officers seated opposite. These were seasoned veterans, their faces carved with the hard lines of years spent upholding or exploiting law. Jason felt the significance of this moment settle into his core. This meeting was a crossroads, a tipping point where his crusade for justice would either gain traction or crumble beneath the weight of opposition. The press lined the back of the room, their cameras poised like vultures circling a battlefield, ready to immortalize every word, every gesture. Jason could feel their scrutiny pressing against him as he took his seat, a tangible force that only fueled his determination. Across the room, Officer McDonald, the grizzled head of the police union, rose to his feet. His posture was rigid, his eyes glinting with a cold, unyielding resolve. "Mr. Hope," McDonald began, his voice slicing through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. "You've been making a lot of noise about reforms, about accountability. But what you're overlooking is that we're the ones who keep this city from falling apart. We protect its people, and now you're standing there, questioning our integrity, our honor." The words were a calculated jab, and Jason felt a surge of heat rise in his chest, a primal urge to strike back, but he steadied himself, drawing a deep breath to anchor his emotions. He knew McDonald's game: provoke him, drag him into a shouting match, discredit him with raw emotion. Jason wouldn't take the bait. He wasn't here to relive old grudges. He was here to forge a new path. "Officer McDonald," he replied, his voice steady and unyielding, cutting through the charged atmosphere, "I don't doubt your dedication to your job. What I question is your loyalty to the truth. What's been happening here isn't about safeguarding the people, it's about shielding a system rotten with lies, corruption, and the abuse of power." A hush fell over the room, Jason's words lingering like a thunderclap, a bold accusation and a vow of retribution all at once. McDonald's eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease breaking through his steely facade. But Jason held his ground, unflinching. This wasn't about who could yell the loudest or posture the hardest. It was about laying bare the reality of a city choking on its own injustices. Leaning forward, Jason locked eyes with McDonald, his voice rising with quiet intensity. "You think this is an attack on law enforcement? You're wrong. This is an assault on a broken system that's let men like Williams and Baker run rampant, abusing their authority without a shred of consequence. It's an assault on a machine that's turned its back on the very people it swore to protect." McDonald's jaw tightened, his lips parting as if to retort, but Jason pressed on, his words relentless. "And don't think it stops with you. The politicians, The businessmen are all part of this network. It's a web of complicity. And it's time we tore it down. If you stand in the way, you'll be exposed right alongside them." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, a wave of shock and recognition washing over the crowd. Jason's words had struck a nerve, and he could see it in the way McDonald's face flushed, the cracks in his armor widening. This wasn't just a legal showdown, it was a moral reckoning. And McDonald was losing his footing with every passing second. Later that evening, Jason sat once more in his office, the echoes of the day's confrontation still ringing in his ears. The city was a fractured mosaic divided by fear and anger, yet united by a burgeoning spark of defiance he'd never witnessed before. He'd lit a fire in the hearts of the people, a restless urgency that pulsed through the streets, a collective cry for something better. They had a voice now, a cause to rally behind, but Jason knew it was only the beginning. The police union wouldn't retreat quietly, they'd dig in their heels, lash out harder. The road ahead was treacherous, lined with obstacles he could only half predict, but he had a vision, a blueprint, not just to expose the rot, but to ensure it could never take root again. His thoughts drifted to the men who'd once humiliated him, the officers who'd wielded their power like a weapon, laughing as they crushed his spirit. He'd face them soon, look them in the eyes, and remind them that justice wasn't a fleeting dream, it was a force, unrelenting and inevitable. The weight of the day pressed down on his shoulders, a mantle of responsibility he carried willingly, even as exhaustion seeped into his frame. The week had been a grueling gauntlet, tense meetings, heated confrontations, and the dawning realization that his fight was far from its end. The soft creak of his office door broke his reverie, and Clara stepped inside, her face a map of worry etched with the quiet strength that had become his anchor. "Jason, there's something you need to see," she said, her voice low but firm as she held up a thick folder, its edges worn from hurried handling. "It's the latest from the police union. They're taking this fight to a whole new level." Jason leaned back, rubbing his temples as a familiar dread coiled in his chest. He'd known this moment was coming, shift from passive resistance to outright sabotage. They'd painted him as a rabble-rouser, a naive idealist meddling in things he couldn't grasp. But this felt different, darker. He gestured for Clara to sit, and she slid the folder across his desk with a heaviness that mirrored his own. Opening it, he found a formal complaint staring back at him, a meticulously crafted document detailing how his relentless push for reform was destabilizing the police force. The accusation was stark. Jason Hope, despite his title, had become a divisive figure, a threat to the fragile threads holding law and order together. It cited vague outside influences and radical groups allegedly pulling his strings, a narrative designed to cast him as a puppet in a larger, sinister game. Clara's voice cut through the silence, sharp with disbelief. "Are they seriously accusing you of being someone's pawn?" Jason stared at the pages, the words blurring as his mind raced. This was more than a counterattack, it was a lesson in the consequences of unchecked power. A stark reminder that those who thrived in corruption would stop at nothing to protect their dominion. But it also underscored the heart of his mission. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about dismantling the systems that enabled them, ensuring that power served the people, not the powerful. With Clara by his side, her resolve mirroring his own, Jason knew the battle was only beginning, and he was ready to fight it to the end. Jason's lips tightened into a thin, rigid line, his jaw clenching as a storm of frustration brewed within him. It wasn't just about tarnishing his reputation anymore, though that had been the initial blow. Now, the police union and their web of loyal supporters had escalated their campaign, twisting his every move into something sinister, even treasonous. In their eyes, he wasn't merely a critic, he had morphed into their archenemy, a looming threat to the fragile peace they swore to protect. The air around him seemed to hum with the weight of their accusations, each one a dagger aimed not just at his work, but at his very soul. "It's more than that," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, though his mind raced like wildfire. "This isn't just strategy, it's personal. They're hell-bent on crippling me, ensuring I can't lift a finger to change anything. If they convince enough people I'm some kind of menace, the reforms I've bled for will collapse before they even take root." Across the room, Clara rose from her chair with a quiet grace, her footsteps soft but deliberate as she approached the window. She stood there, gazing out over the sprawling city, where the sun dipped low, painting the skyline in hues of amber and gold. Yet, despite the warmth of the light, a chill hung in the air, a palpable tension that seemed to seep through the glass and settle into her bones. She crossed her arms, her fingers tightening against her sleeves as if to ward off the unease creeping up her spine. Outside, the streets buzzed with life, oblivious to the gathering storm she could feel brewing. Jason sensed it too, that deceptive stillness before chaos unfurls, and it gnawed at him, sharpening his resolve even as it deepened his dread. Over the next few days, the city's atmosphere thickened with unease, a tension so heavy it seemed to press against every window and door. The local media, quick to latch onto a juicy narrative, parroted the police union's venomous rhetoric. Newsrooms churned out interviews with officers, their faces stern and voices grave, warning of the perils of radical change. They painted Jason's push for reform as a reckless assault on their morale, a betrayal of the very order they upheld. Their words cut deep, striking a chord with those too fearful to embrace the unknown or too weary to grasp the rot festering beneath the surface. Jason watched it unfold from his small office, the flickering TV screen casting shadows across his furrowed brow. He knew this was no accident. This was a calculated strike to flip the script, to cast him as the villain rather than the cure. The backlash wasn't unexpected, but its ferocity shook him. Still, he squared his shoulders, his promises to the community echoing in his mind like a sacred vow. He wouldn't let a handful of power-drunk men snuff out the flickering hope for justice. One crisp morning, as the first threads of dawn stitched light into the sky, Jason arrived at City Hall. The air was cool, the streets still quiet save for the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. He had called for a meeting with the mayor, knowing full well that the older man's endorsement could tip the scales in the war ahead. As he strode through the echoing hallways, his footsteps reverberated off the polished floors, each sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the building. The weight of history bore down on him, centuries of voices stifled, dreams crushed, and battles lost whispering through the walls. He paused at the mayor's door, his hand hovering over the knob, steadying himself for the fight to come. Inside, Mayor Green sat behind his oak desk, his hands clasped tightly, fingers interlaced as if anchoring himself against the tide. Weariness etched lines into his face, but beneath the fatigue burned a flicker of defiance, a spark Jason recognized as kin to his own. "You've been stirring the pot, Jason," the mayor said, leaning forward, his voice low but steady, his eyes locking onto Jason's with an intensity that demanded truth. "I've seen the headlines, heard the chatter. The union's not going to let this slide. They're digging in their heels." Jason settled into the chair opposite, his posture unyielding, meeting the mayor's gaze head-on. "I know they're out for blood," he replied, his tone even but laced with steel. "But I'm not here to play their games or dissect their politics. I'm here because I can't do this alone. I need your voice, your weight behind me." The mayor fell silent, his brow creasing as he weighed Jason's plea. The room grew still, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, he spoke, his words deliberate. "What exactly are you asking for?" Jason inhaled deeply, choosing his next move with the precision of a chess master. "I need you to stand with me publicly. The people need to see us united. If they know you're in my corner, the city will follow. Without that, the union and their cronies will drown us. They'll bury everything we fought for." Mayor Green nodded slowly, a grim understanding settling over him. "I'm with you, Jason. But brace yourself, this isn't going to be clean. The union's got teeth, and they'll bite before they back down." Jason's eyes didn't waver. "I'm ready," he said, and in that moment, he meant it with every fiber of his being. The storm he'd foreseen crashed into the city the following week, a tempest of fury and stakes higher than he'd ever faced. A public hearing was announced, a crucible where Jason would either forge his legacy or watch it crumble to ash. The police union unleashed their full arsenal, flooding every channel, television, radio, social media with venomous attacks on his character. They branded him a fraud, a puppet of shadowy agitators, a man too naive to lead and too dangerous to trust. Jason stepped into the hearing room that day, his heart a steady drumbeat in his chest, his mind razor-sharp despite the chaos swirling around him. The space buzzed with the usual suspect city counselors in crisp suits, department heads with guarded expressions, journalists scribbling furiously in their notepads. The air crackled with anticipation, thick and heavy, as if the room itself held its breath. Officer McDonald took the podium first, his broad shoulders squared, his demeanor oozing confidence honed by years of command. A veteran with graying temples and a voice that carried like a gavel. He was the union's chosen champion. His speech was a masterpiece of manipulation, every word polished to sway the crowd. He framed Jason as an interloper, a disruptor with no business meddling in their world. This man, McDonald declared, his tone dripping with disdain, is unfit to lead. He's a pawn of outsiders, tearing apart the very fabric of our department. His so-called reforms are a cancer-spreading chaos, undermining our honor. The accusations landed like blows, familiar yet sharper now, amplified by the officer's gravitas and the crowd's murmurs of agreement. But Jason was ready. When his turn came, he rose slowly, deliberately, his movements calm against the storm of hostility. He stepped to the podium, his hands steady as he gripped its edges, his voice cutting through the din with quiet power. "I've heard the charges leveled against me," he began, his eyes sweeping the room, locking onto faces both friendly and hostile. "I've listened to the fear, the anger, and I get it. Change is a beast, it's messy, it's hard. But this isn't about me, it's about the people we've failed. The families left voiceless, the lives snuffed out by a system that's supposed to shield them, not shatter them. That's what we're here for, not just reform, but justice." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, the silence stretching taut. "And if you stand against that, you're no different from the ones who've kept this wheel of suffering spinning." The room froze, his words a thunderclap reverberating through the space. Whispers rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock and awe. Jason stood tall, his pulse hammering, the eyes of every soul in that room boring into him. He felt the enormity of its history, the expectation, the fragile hope teetering on his shoulders. This wasn't just a speech, it was a reckoning, a vow etched in the air. He was no longer fighting alone, carried the weight of every broken family, every silenced cry, every soul crushed by the very power meant to protect them. In the weeks that followed, the city transformed. Jason's stand at the hearing had ignited a spark, a wildfire of resolve that swept through the streets. The community, once fractured and muted, found its voice. Protests erupted, not the chaotic clashes of old, but peaceful marches, their chants a chorus of unity and demand. Banners waved high, painted with pleas for fairness, for change. Jason became their beacon, a man who'd stared into the jaws of the system and refused to blink. Yet the union doubled down, their attacks growing uglier, more personal. They smeared him as a radical, a rabble-rouser unfit to lead, their voices amplified by a media eager for drama. Phone calls flooded his office, some lifting him up, others tearing him down, while Clara, his steadfast ally, stood by him, her quiet strength a lifeline in the tempest. Through it all, Jason saw the lesson carved in every struggle. Justice was a flame worth tending. But power, when abused, devoured everything in its path. The union's desperation laid bare their fear not of him, but of the truth he carried. And as the city rallied, he knew the fight was far from over, but the tide was turning, driven by a collective hunger for something better, something right. In the midst of a swirling storm of chaos, Jason and Clara found themselves hunched over a cluttered desk late into the night, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of a flickering lamp. Papers were strewn everywhere, reports piled high, documents scribbled with notes, and maps marked with frantic lines. The air was thick with tension as they pored over every detail, strategizing their next move. Each word they exchanged carried a weight that pressed against Jason's chest, a constant reminder of why he'd chosen this grueling path. It wasn't just about reform anymore, it was personal, a vow etched into his soul despite the risks that loomed like shadows. And the toll it took on his spirit. Every glance at Clara, with her furrowed brow and determined eyes, rekindled that spark inside him, a quiet fire that refused to be snuffed out, no matter how hard the world tried to drown it. One evening, As the clock ticked past midnight, Clara's voice broke through the haze of exhaustion. "Jason, you can't pretend it's not getting worse," she said, her tone laced with a worry she couldn't hide. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if anchoring herself against the storm they were facing. "The police union's coming after you with everything they've got. Leaks are popping up left and right, twisted lies. Fake reports all designed to drag your name through the mud. Even the mayor's office is feeling the heat now." Her words hung heavy in the air, and Jason felt them settle into his bones. He leaned back in his creaky chair, rubbing his temples as though he could massage away the pressure building there. "I know, Clara," he murmured, his voice rough with fatigue. "I feel it too, like a noose tightening every day. But we can't stop. Not now. Not after all we've clawed our way through." He offered her a tired smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I didn't come this far to crumble when the fight gets ugly. I made promesso myself. To the people, and I'll be damned if I break them." Clara watched him closely, her gaze softening as she took in the man before her. She'd always known Jason as the unshakable one, the leader who stood tall when others faltered, his calm demeanor a beacon in the darkest moments. But tonight, she saw the cracksmall fissures in his armor that revealed the human beneath. His shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, and for the first time, she noticed the faint tremble in his hands as he spoke. Doubt gnawed at him, testing the resolve she'd once thought unbreakable. Yet, even now, there was something fierce in his eyes, a stubborn ember that refused to die. He wasn't just battling for policy changes. He was waging war for the dignity of every soul the system had trampled, those ignored, abused, or silenced by a machine that thrived on unchecked power. "You're right," she said finally, her voice steady as she reached across the table to rest a hand on his arm. "You've come too far to let it slip away now. But don't forget, son, you are not carrying this alone. We've got the people behind us. And the truth, that's our strongest weapon." The next day dawned gray and heavy, the sky mirroring the mood as Jason stepped into the city council chamber. The room buzzed with restless energy reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing like lightning, while activists whispered among themselves, clutching signs scrawled with pleas for justice. The public filled every seat, their eyes fixed on Jason as he took his place at the podium. The stakes had never felt so towering, a mountain he'd have to climb, with the whole city watching. He was there to unveil a set of reforms that would shake the police department to its core, forcing it to reckon with a legacy stained by corruption and brutality. His proposal was a bold, strokey plan to rewrite the rules from the ground up. It demanded a complete overhaul of police training, weaving in lessons on anti-racism and de-escalation until they were second nature. It called for an independent review board, one with real teeth, able to dig into misconduct claims and hand down decisions that couldn't be ignored. And most daring of all, it insisted that officers with histories of racial profiling or violence be stripped of their badges, no exceptions. Standing there, Jason felt the weight of every word he was about to speak. "These reforms aren't optional," he began, his voice steady but ringing with a quiet fury. "We can't keep turning away from the systemic rot that's been eating at our community for generations. This isn't just about tweaking a few policies, it's about tearing down a culture that's festered too long. We need a police force that lives up to the values of the people it serves, not one that hides behind badges and impunity, treating the community like an enemy to be subdued." As the words poured out, he could feel history pressing against him, a tidal wave of past wrongs urging him forward. This wasn't just advocacy, it was a reckoning, a direct challenge to the structures that had propped up the powerful for far too long. The room fell silent, save for the rustle of papers and the occasional cough from the back. Jason's eyes swept over the council members. Some shifted uncomfortably, others narrowed their gazes in skepticism, and a few glared with open hostility. Beside him stood the mayor, a steadfast ally who'd weathered his own share of storms in this fight. The man stepped forward, his presence commanding as he squared his shoulders. "I stand with Jason," he declared, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "These changes are overdue, painfully so. We can't keep pretending the injustices rotting in our police department don't exist. It's time to act." His support was a lifeline, but as the meeting wore on, cracks began to show. Several council members pushed back hard, their voices rising over the murmurs of the crowd. "You're asking for chaos," one snapped, his face flushed with frustration. "The police union won't stand for this. They'll see it as a betrayal. You'll fracture the department when we need unity most," another chimed in, her tone sharp and clipped. "These reforms could alienate the very officers we rely on. You're playing with fire, Jason, and we'll all get burned." Their warnings echoed through the chamber, painting a picture of division and backlash that made even the mayor's jaw tighten. Jason listened, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, his mind churned. He understood their fierce, knew the union's influence ran deep. It's a lies, a web of power that could choke out any change. But he'd seen what happened when that power went unchecked. He'd walked through neighborhoods where trust in the law had long since crumbled, where mothers wept over sons lost to a system that didn't care. He'd felt the sting of it himself, the way corruption could twist justice into something unrecognizable. This wasn't about pleasing everyone, it was about doing what was right, even if it meant standing alone against the tide. Justice demanded sacrifice, and he'd learned that lesson the hard way. To abuse power was to invite consequences, swift, sometimes slow but always inevitable. As the meeting drew to a close, the council voted to delay the decision, tabling Jason's proposal for another week. "We need more time to deliberate," the chair announced, his tone clipped and final. It was a blow, a stumble on a path already littered with obstacles, but Jason didn't flinch. This was just one skirmish in a war that stretched far beyond that room. He knew the real fight was still ahead. The union's attacks would sharpen, their narrative poisoning the airwaves. Already, the media had begun to spin their tales, fueled by leaks and half-truths. Headlines branded him a radical, a danger to order, a man unfit to lead. Dangerous, no. Jason thought as he stepped out of the chamber, his mind a whirlwind of plans and possibilities. Determined that that's what he was. This wasn't about his own legacy anymore. It was about the city's soul, about a future where kids could grow up without fear shadowing their every step. Outside, the evening air hit him like a bomb, crisp and cool against his flushed skin. The streets stretched out before him, quieter than usual, as if holding their breath. People lingered in the distance, ordinary folks who'd heard whispers of the meeting, who'd seen the news vans circling like vultures. They were waiting, he realized, waiting for him to show them that change wasn't just a dream. And deep down, Jason felt it too. The storm wasn't over, but the clouds were thinning. When the dust settled, the city wouldn't be the same. Justice, he knew, was a slow burn, but its flames couldn't be doused forever. Meanwhile, across town, the story took an unexpected turn. On a sunlit morning in Central Park, where laughter mingled with the chirping of birds, Colonel Alyssa Carter jogged along a winding path, dressed in a simple tracksuit. Her strong frame and warm brown skin blended seamlessly with the crowd. No one would have guessed she was one of the military's most formidable women. It was a rare day off, a chance to breathe, and she savored it, her sharp eyes scanning the world around her. Then came the sound of small, broken sob cutting through the chatter. She slowed, her gaze locking onto a little boy crumpled beside a bench, clutching a teddy bear as tears streaked his dirt-smudged face. He couldn't have been more than 3, his tiny body trembling with fear. Alyssa glanced around, searching for a frantic parent, but the park hummed on, oblivious. Her heart tugged. Ignoring him wasn't an option. She approached slowly, kneeling until her eyes met his. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice a gentle anchor. "Are you lost?" The boy shrank back, hugging his bear tighter, his wide eyes brimming with confusion and distrust. Alyssa's chest tightened. She knew that look, the raw vulnerability of someone adrift. "I'm Alyssa," she continued, keeping her tone light, soothing. "I won't hurt you, I promise. How about we find your mom together?" He stared at her, his breath hitching, until finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he stammered, "Can't see Mom." "Where's Mom?" Alyssa smiled, a warmth spreading through her as she held out a hand. "We'll figure it out, okay? You're not alone now." In that moment, two stories converged: Jason's battle for justice on a grand scale, and Alyssa's quiet act of compassion in the park. Both carried the same truth: power, when wielded with care, could heal when abused. It left scars that rippled far beyond the moment. The consequences of those choices, whether in council chambers or on a sun-dappled bench, would shape the world they left behind. In the heart of a sunlit park, where the air buzzed with the gentle hum of spring and the laughter of children echoed faintly in the distance, a small boy stood clutching a worn teddy bear. His head hung low, strands of messy brown hair falling over his eyes as he murmured, barely audible, "I'm Max." His voice trembled, fragile as a leaf caught in the wind, and his tiny fingers gripped the bear tighter, as though it were his only anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Beside him, Alyssa, a woman with warm eyes and a quiet strength, crouched down to his level. "Max," she said softly, her tone wrapping around his name like a comforting embrace. "That's a beautiful name." Her gaze softened further, a flicker of empathy lighting her features as she took in the boy's nervous glances, his eyes darting around the sprawling park, searching for something or seeing a failure. "Can you stand?" Max, Alyssa asked, her voice steady yet tender. "Like a lighthouse cutting through fog. We'll find your mother together. I won't leave ya, we promise." Max hesitated, his small frame tensing as if weighing her words against the storm of fear swirling inside him. After a moment, he gave a faint nod, letting her gently lift him to his feet. His grip on the teddy bear never wavered, its frayed fur pressed against his chest like a shield. As Alyssa guided him forward, she moved with deliberate slowness, her sneakers scuffing softly against the gravel path. The park stretched out around them, vibrant green lawns dotted with picnickers, towering oaks casting dappled shadows, and the distant chime of an ice cream truck weaving through the afternoon air. She kept her voice low and soothing, asking him about his favorite toys, whether he had brothers or sisters, nothing to tether him to calm. But Max's answers came in whispers, clipped and cautious, his eyes still scanning the horizon with a restless urgency. Unbeknownst to Alyssa, a pair of sharp, suspicious eyes tracked her every move from a distance. Officer Jack Miller, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a badge glinting on his chest, had just stepped into the park, his boots crunching against the earth as he began his routine patrol. The moment he spotted Alyssa holding Max's hand, something in his gut twisted, a spark of doubt that flared into certainty within seconds. To Jack, the scene didn't add up. The woman's casual tracksuit, her tan skin, the way she tugged gently at the boy's arm, it all screamed wrong in his mind, colored by years of snap judgments and unspoken biases. "What's going on here?" he muttered under his breath, his thick fingers brushing the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. "That woman's pulling the kid. Doesn't look right." His jaw tightened as he strode closer, his heavy footsteps muffled by the grass, his gaze locked on Alyssa like a hawk zeroing in on prey. Alyssa, oblivious to the shadow creeping nearer, kept her focus on Max. She knelt briefly to adjust his shoelace, her voice a steady hum as she promised him they were almost at the security checkpoint. The path ahead wound through a cluster of blooming azaleas, their pink petals trembling in the breeze, leading toward a small wooden booth where park staff could reunite Max with his mother. But just as she rose to guide him forward, a voice sliced through the air like a blade of harsh, commanding and laced with accusation. "Stop right there." Alyssa spun around, her heart lurching as she faced Jack striding toward her. His hand rested on the holster at his waist, his cold blue eyes boring into her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone rough as gravel. Alyssa frowned, forcing herself to stay composed despite the sudden knot of unease tightening in her chest. "I'm just helping this boy," she explained, gesturing to Max, who shrank closer to her side. "He's lost, and I'm taking him to security." Jack's expression didn't soften. "Is this child yours?" he snapped, cutting her off before she could elaborate. "No, but Alyssa began, only for Jack to barrel over her words. "If he's not yours, you've got no right to touch him. Take your hands off him now." His voice rose, sharp and unyielding, and Max flinched, a sob breaking free as he buried his face against Alyssa's leg. The sound tore at her heart, frustration bubbling up as she shot back, "Officer, you're scaring him." "I told you, I'm just helping." Jack smirked, a thin, humorless curl of his lips that sent a chill down Alyssa's spine. "Look, I don't know who you are or what you're up to, but I don't let anyone kidnap kids on my watch. Step aside, or I'll take drastic measures." His hand twitched toward his gun, a silent threat that hung heavy in the air. Alyssa's breath caught, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior as she fought to keep her voice even. "I'm Colonel Alyssa Carter, U.S. Army," she said, her words deliberate and firm. "I'm not a kidnapper. If you don't believe me, call park security or verify my identity." But to Jack, her claim was laughably flimsy lie concocted by a woman who didn't fit his narrow vision of authority. A military colonel, in a tracksuit, with skin like hers. His mind rejected it outright, years of prejudice hardening his resolve. "I don't care who you say you are," he barked, his voice booming now. "Put your hands on your head and get on your knees." Max's cries grew louder, his small body trembling as he clung to Alyssa, the teddy bear dangling precariously from his grasp. She glanced down at him, her heart aching with a fierce protectiveness, then locked eyes with Jack. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her tone steely despite the chaos unfolding around her. The park, once a haven of peace, now pulsed with tension. A small crowd had gathered, joggers pausing mid-stride, parents clutching their own children, a teenager fumbling with his phone to record the scene. Jack's shouts reverberated through the open space, drawing more curious stares. But no one stepped forward. "Kneel, now," Jack roared again, his face flushing red, his hand gripping the holster tighter. Alyssa stood her ground, her pride a blazing fire in her chest. Though worry for Max gnawed at her resolve. "You're losing it," she said calmly, though her voice carried an edge. "I'm not a threat. I'm Colonel Alyssa Carter, and this boy is lost. Check my identity before you do something stupid." Jack's rage flared, her composure only fueling his suspicion. "Don't disobey me," he bellowed, spittle flying as his temper unraveled. The onlookers murmured, a few voices rising in protest. "She's just helping the kid." But Jack was beyond reason, his world narrowed to the woman defying him. "I won't kneel," Alyssa declared, her voice ringing out clear and defiant. "I've done nothing wrong, and I won't let you insult me or endanger this child." In that moment, Jack's control snapped. He yanked his gun from its holster, the metal gleaming in the sunlight as he leveled it at Alyssa. "This is your final warning," he shouted, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and exhilaration. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath as fear rippled through them. Alyssa felt the weight of the barrel trained on her, a cold dread settling in her bones. But she met his gaze unflinchingly. "You're making a grave mistake," she warned, her words laced with a quiet power. "I'm a military officer. I've spent my life protecting this country, and now you're threatening me because of how I look. Think twice before you regret this." Her defiance struck Jack like a match to dry tinder. His anger, stoked by prejudice and wounded pride, consumed him. As Alyssa shifted slightly, bending to comfort Max, Jack misread the motion on a twitch of his finger. A deafening bang, and the world shattered. The gunshot tore through the park, a brutal punctuation to the mounting chaos. Alyssa crumpled, clutching her thigh as blood seeped through her fingers, staining the grass beneath her. Max wailed, dropping to his knees beside her, his teddy bear falling into the dirt as he reached for her with desperate hands. "She's been shot," someone yelled, panic erupting as the crowd surged backward, phones trembling in their grips. "Call an ambulance." Jack stood frozen, the gun still smoking in his hand, his wide eyes reflecting the horror of what he'd done. His breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of his actions crashing down as reality pierced through his clouded judgment. Alyssa lifted her head, pain twisting her features, but her gaze burned with an unyielding fury. "You shot me," she rasped, her voice cutting through the clamor. "An army colonel." "For what?" "Because I was helping a child," Jack stammered, words failing him as the distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the stunned silence. Sheriff Roy Anderson arrived moments later, his patrol car screeching to a halt. A tall man with graying hair and a stern demeanor. He stepped out, his eyes widening as he recognized Alyssa, her face familiar from a military honors ceremony he'd attended months prior. "Oh my God, Alyssa Carter," he exclaimed, rushing to her side and dropping to one knee. "Alyssa, are you okay? Who did this?" She met his gaze, her voice steady despite the agony pulsing through her leg. "He shot me," she said, nodding toward Jack. "He didn't believe who I was, just saw what he wanted to see." Roy's head snapped toward Jack, fury blazing in his eyes. "What the hell did you do?" he roared. "Do you know who she is? This is Colonel Alyssa Cartera, national hero." Jack's face drained of color, his stammered excuses, "I didn't know." I thought, drowned out by the crowd's rising outrage. Roy didn't waste another breath. "Cuff him," he ordered his deputies, then turned back to Alyssa as paramedics swarmed in, their urgent voices overlapping with Max's tearful sobs. Alyssa lay back, her hand pressed against the wound, blood warm and sticky against her palm. The physical pain was sharp, relentless, but it paled beside the deeper wound sting of injustice, the betrayal of being judged not for her actions, but for the skin she wore. Max knelt beside her, his small hands clutching her arm, his tear-streaked face a mirror of her own turmoil. As the paramedics worked, she reached for him, whispering through gritted teeth, "It's okay, Max. We'll find your mom." In that fractured moment, the park stood as a testament to a bitter truth. Power unchecked by reason breeds chaos, and justice, when twisted by blind assumption, cuts deeper than any bullet. Jack's downfall was swift, his badge now a shackle, but for Alyssa, the scar seen and unseen would linger, a reminder of the cost of standing tall in a world too quick to condemn. The air was thick with tension that afternoon in the park, a sprawling expanse of green dotted with ancient oaks and winding paths. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the grass as a young woman named Alyssa lay crumpled on the ground, her military uniform stained with a growing patch of crimson. A medic, his hands trembling slightly from the urgency of the moment, knelt beside her, pressing a wad of gauze against the wound on her leg, his brow furrowed with concentration as he worked to staunch the bleeding, his movements quick but deliberate. Around them, a crowd began to form, drawn like moths to a flame by the chaos unfolding before their eyes. Some stood in stunned silence, their faces pale and eyes wide, while others erupted into shouts that pierced the air like shards of glass. "She didn't do anything wrong," one voice cried, sharp with indignation. "That cop should be Fred, doesn't deserve to wear a badge," another bellowed, the words heavy with fury. The clamor swelled, a rising tide of outrage that seemed to feed on itself, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. In the center of this storm stood Jack, the officer responsible for the gunshot that had brought Alyssa down. His wrists were bound by cold steel handcuffs, and his once proud posture had crumbled into something small and uncertain. Gone was the brash confidence that had fueled his actions moments earlier, with swaggering certainty that had led him to draw his weapon without hesitation. Now his eyes darted nervously from face to face in the crowd, his breath shallow and ragged. Fear crept into his chest, a cold, unfamiliar sensation that clawed at his insides. He had acted on instinct, on a split-second judgment colored by prejudice he hadn't even recognized in himself, until it was too late. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, and for the first time, he felt the sting of being truly seen it as an authority figure, but as a man who had crossed a line. Nearby, Roy, the grizzled police chief with salt and pepper hair and a face etched with years of hard decisions, barked orders to his officers. His voice cut through the din, steady, but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "Get every video those people recorded," he commanded, his stern gaze sweeping over the sea of smartphones held aloft by trembling hands. "I want to know exactly what happened, every angle, every second." His officers nodded, scattering to collect the evidence that would piece together this nightmare. Roy turned then, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel path as he approached Alyssa. She was being lifted onto a stretcher now, her face pale, but her jaw set with a quiet strength that belied her pain. He stopped a few feet away, his broad shoulders slumping as he met her eyes. Guilt gnawed at him, a bitter taste in his mouth. "Alyssa," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm so sorry. This is a terrible mistake. I swear I'll get to the bottom of it. Justice will be done." Alyssa managed a faint smile, though it was strained, her lips trembling as she fought the agony radiating from her leg. "A mistake," she murmured, her voice low but cutting. "A gun went off, Roy." This isn't just a misunderstanding's prejudice. It's a sickness in the system we've let fester for too long. I'm not the only one who's been hurt by it." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, and Roy bowed his head, unable to muster a reply. He felt the truth of what she said settle into his bones, a heavy burden he couldn't shake. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped off, its siren wailing into the distance, he stood rooted to the spot, the crowd's accusations echoing in his ears. Inside the ambulance, Alyssa lay still, her mind a whirlwind of pain and memory. The stretcher jostled slightly with every turn, but she barely noticed. Her body ached, a deep, throbbing reminder of the bullet that had torn through her flesh. Yet it was her spirit that felt most battered. She was a military officer, hardened by years of service in war-torn lands where danger lurked around every corner. She had faced death before started down and walked away unbroken. But this was different. This was a betrayal, a violation by someone meant to protect, not harm. Her thoughts spiraled back to the moment it happened, Jack's cold, unlistening stare as she tried to explain herself. The way he'd gripped his gun with a certainty that left no room for doubt. He hadn't seen here a decorated soldier, a human being. He'd seen only the color of her skin, a shade that didn't fit his narrow vision of innocence. The realization burned, a quiet rage simmering beneath her exhaustion. At the hospital, the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as Alyssa was wheeled into the intensive care unit. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, their voices hushed but urgent as they tended to her. Sheriff Roy arrived soon after, his boots echoing down the linoleum hallway. The staff cast sidelong glances at him, some reproachful, others merely curious whispers trailing in his wake. He carried the weight of the incident like a millstone around his neck. This wasn't just Jack's failure, it was his, as chief. He oversaw a system that had allowed this to happen, a system stained by bias and unchecked power. When he stepped into Alyssa's room, he found her propped up in bed, her right leg swathed in bandages. Fatigue shadowed her face, but her eyes burned with a clarity that made him pause. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the room. "A little," she replied, her tone even but firm. "But Roy, this isn't just about me. You know that, don't you?" There was no bitterness in her words, only the weary resolve of someone who had seen too much wrong in the world. Roy exhaled, a long, shaky breath. "I know," he admitted. "We've got Jack in custody. I'm promising a fair investigation, but I need your help, Alyssa. You're more than a victim here. You're a symbol. This could spark real change." Her lips curved into a tired smile, though her eyes remained steely. "If you want change, Roy, don't just promise it. Do it. Justice isn't just for me, it's for everyone who's been crushed by this system." He nodded, her words striking a chord deep within him. He knew she was right, and he felt the enormity of his duty shift. This wasn't about punishing one man. It was about dismantling the rock that had taken root under his watch. Meanwhile, the incident had exploded across social media, a wildfire of outrage spreading through screens nationwide. Grainy cell phone videos captured every moment: Jack's raised gun, Alyssa's crumpled form. The crowd's furious crescent, they ricocheted across platforms, shared and reshared until millions had borne witness. Headlines blazed, military hero shot over racial bias, the painful truth of policing in America. Articles dissected Jack's actions, pundits debated on air, and protests erupted in cities far beyond the park's borders. Alyssa's story transcended her personal pain, becoming a rallying cry for those who'd long demanded reform. She felt the shift even from her hospital bed, the weight of countless unheard voices now resting on her shoulders. She resolved then to speak not just for herself, but for every soul silenced by injustice. A week later, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Alyssa sat in a wheelchair, her gaze locked on Jack. He stood in the dock, his uniform replaced by a plain gray jumpsuit, his face gaunt and ashen. Surgery had saved her leg, but the days of recovery had left her introspective, her mind replaying not just her own ordeal, but the countless others it mirrored. The judge, a silver-haired woman with a voice like tempered steel, struck her gavel against the bench. "This case," she declared, "is not merely about one man's actions. It exposes a deeper flaw bias and misconduct woven into the fabric of law enforcement. After reviewing the evidence videos, testimonies, all of Edie sentenced Jack Miller to 15 years for abuse of power, assault, and ethical violations. A ripple ran through the room, soft applause, nods of approval, a few stifled gasps. Jack muttered an apology, his voice barely audible. But Alyssa didn't acknowledge it. Her fight wasn't with him alone, it was with the system that had emboldened him. Outside, reporters swarmed her, microphones thrusting forward like spears. A young journalist, her eyes bright with urgency, asked, "Miss Alyssa, what do you think of the verdict? What's your message to the public?" Alyssa inhaled deeply, her gaze piercing the camera lens. "I'm not celebrating Jack's sentence," she said, her voice steady. "I hope he reflects and changes. But this can't keep happening. We need better training. We need to root out bias. And we need to see people for who they are and not their skin or their status." Her words carried a quiet power, a call to action that lingered long after the cameras clicked off. In the weeks that followed, Roy threw himself into reform. He rolled out mandatory bias training, enforced body camera use, and vowed swift punishment for any abuse of power. The department felt the shift, a slow but seismic change driven by the lessons of that day. One crisp autumn morning, Alyssa returned to the park, settling onto a bench where it had all begun. A boy named Maximo, weary, with a grin that lit up the world, raced toward her. Clutching a bouquet of wildflowers, "Alyssa," he shouted, thrusting them into her hands. "Are you better? I missed you." She laughed, a sound warm and genuine, pulling him into a hug. "Much better, thanks to you, brave boy. I'm so proud of you." Max's mother, a woman with soft eyes and a gentle smile, joined them. Sitting close, "I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved Max and you opened our eyes to what needs to change." Alyssa took her hand, her own eyes shining with warmth. "We all owe each other that much," she said. "The fight's not over, but as long as we hold on to hope and keep pushing, we'll get there." The park stretched out before them, peaceful now, a quiet testament to the power of one voice and the ripple it could send through a fractured world. Justice, she knew, wasn't just a verdict, it was a promise to do better, a lesson carved from the consequences of power misused. And she would carry that lesson forward, for herself and for all who came after.